Hi, I'm Emily Therrell with the UAH Department of History, UAH Archives, and Mount Paran Campground and Cemetery. In the summer of 2020, I did a project with UAH's RCEU program, which is Research and Creative Experiences for Undergrads, with the goal of creating a digital map of Mount Paran Cemetery, which I would like to tell you about now. To begin with, I'd like to discuss the purpose of this project, which was that cemeteries are a depleting source of historical, geological, and architectural information. As you can see in the image to the right, several headstones have eroded away with time. The above ground tombs are coming apart from the initial slabs. Most cemeteries contain a wealth of information, including things like the durability of rocks, history of disease, different factors that affected lifespans, genealogical research, different military veterans tend to have markers on their stones. Cemeteries are also withering away every single year. The digital preservation of these cemeteries through mapping projects, online databases, and similar goals gives us a way to preserve these resources for the future. This is a relatively new area. Technologically, it's been a field that's been adapting over the past decade or two, but is still quite limited. Whenever we were doing our preliminary research on this project, there wasn't a whole lot to look at that other places had done. We chose Mount Paran specifically because they have several prominent historical figures within North Alabama history buried there, to include Samuel King Davis and Isaacreiner, who were early pioneers to the area, as well as multiple slaves that belong to families that are buried there and the descendants of those slaves. So this cemetery specifically shows important historical moments and a demographic history of the area that it's located in. So to go about this project, Dr. Sears and I first began with reading several books, or not books, but articles, explaining ways that other cemeteries had created their own digital archives and digital databases and maps. Gibbons from the UAH Archives also helped us get familiar with different historical preservation digitization techniques. Specifically, she trained us in Omeka, which is a mapping software. Once we had a grasp on the software, we really buckled down on finding primary and secondary sources discussing the people buried in the cemetery, their relation to Newmarket, Alabama, and the greater Huntsville story. Now, this is kind of where we had to take some adaptations, as we figured out the software could not map the cemetery by itself, and it would take a lot more in-person work than we could do while having to work remotely during COVID. So instead, we refocused and created a database within a Google spreadsheet that organized information about the individuals buried at Mount Paran, so that at a later date we could come back and create that cemetery map, but in the meantime the information was preserved. I also created a companion historic map of Newmarket using information especially from the National Register of Historic Places, local archaeologists and historians, descendants, and so on. With all the information that I had compiled, I created a narrative to go alongside the map to explain the relation between Newmarket and its history with the Mount Paran burials and the North Alabama story. So here on the left, you can see the historic map of Newmarket. Each of those blue points, if you click on them within the map website, it will tell you a little bit about what's there, the history of it, where that information is from, and it will also link you to the timeline visible at the bottom of the map to tell you when that was created. On the right side of the screen is one of my prominent sources that I used for this project, which is A History of Madison County and incidentally of North Alabama, 1732 to 1840 by Judge Thomas Jones Taylor. Taylor wrote this in 1880. It was published by the Confederate Publishing Company, which meant that while reading it, I had to consider what biases may be portrayed there and what stories weren't being told. But it did have a good amount of verifiable information regarding individuals buried at Mount Paran. This is the database. which, as you can see, has the necessary metadata to eventually transfer it to a new format. It focused on the Davis family to begin with. And off to the right, you can see the Library of Congress subject marking what is at a specific point and what is prominent about that person. Certain people, there was nothing more to say about them, like Jane Allison Davis. You can see her subjects are nothing more than gravestones because women typically did not have as easily verifiable history. Now, one of the key findings of this project was finding sources that related to it. Beyond actually going to the cemetery and analyzing the headstones, trying to piece together some of the headstones that were in worse condition, finding primary and secondary sources was imperative to this project. So again, I mentioned the book by Judge John Taylor Jones. I mentioned the National Register of Historic Places. A descendant of the Criner family, Jerry Dean Criner, published online in 2003 the Isaacreiner story as well as several family photos. However, upon his death, his sources were lost and there's no way to verify his story, so it is technically considered an oral folklore from descendants. The Huntsville Times newspaper also had a wealth of information about obituaries, marriages, different major events that occurred during the lifetimes of those buried at Mount Paran. One of the trends that showed in Mount Paran is that Revolutionary War soldiers, or else just soldiers who fought during the Revolutionary War, were some of the earliest to settle Madison County. Samuel King Davis was one, which ties him to Llewellyn Jones, who was actually buried on campus at UAH and fought at Valley Forge with George Washington. I also found a disparity in lifespans between race, but that women and men tended to live about the same amount of time. And there were a few notable people that we'll talk about in just a minute. So within the lifespan data, for white people this measures people who were born as early as 1751 and died as late as 1907. This is a sample group of 15 individuals, 8 men and 7 women. And as you can see, all of them lived roughly 61.3 years. Whereas for Black people who were in the cemetery, there were only 9 whose dates were preserved outside of infant mortality rates, which tend to skew data and were thus excluded. Men tended to live to be almost 46, women lived to about 48, with the average being 47. However, this is one of those examples of why historic preservation is so important as early as possible, because while I could have used a much larger sample group for the white side of the graph, this is all there is for the Black side. And that is one of the things that we have to preserve while we can, because especially African American headstones tend to disintegrate faster, because at the time after the Civil War, which is when all of these are from, as you can see, the earliest birth date is 1887. A lot of headstones were made from cheaper material or were not as elegantly made due to poverty. And we have such limited information that it has to be preserved while it can be. Now, for a few notable people, we will start with Samuel King Davis. As you can see in the picture, it says Revolutionary Soldier, Virginia Militia, 1776 to 1788. And this marker was placed by, I believe it was the Something Spring Daughters of the American Revolution, which is a North Alabama group of the Daughters of the American Revolution. However, Samuel King Davis was in the Virginia militia, but he only fought Native Americans, as he had a vendetta against those who had killed his father some years before. He did not fight the British, or if he did, there is no remaining record of it. Samuel King Davis is also a prominent figure because he is said to have been the one to lay the original logs of the cabin that John Hunt settled in Big Spring Park, which was the founding of Huntsville. Isaacreiner, another early pioneer, tended to tell the story of his settling of his abode in Newmarket, and would quote Samuel as saying that he would not be neighbors with a man who would use another man's logs. And this is Isaacreiner, who we have quite a bit of descendants information about. There's the Criner house on the left. You can see in the back behind it a little bit of a slave cabin. And on top are the two chimneys, which centuries or over a century later would be the only remaining marker of where the house had been until even the chimneys fell apart and there's conflicting reports on if they were stolen, eroded away, or if the descendants took them. Now, Isaacreiner was born in the 1780s and lived to 1876. He told the story very often of his coming to Newmarket, and it is recounted in Judge John Taylor Jones' book, which is a secondary source about Newmarket, which was written only 4 years after Criner's death. Now, Isaacreiner's story is also a prominent example of how African-American immigration happened almost simultaneously with white immigration. The first few to come to North Alabama were mostly poorer folks who were looking for new land. However, by the time the Criners and Davises and such got there, they brought with them slaves. By the 1810 census, there were 4 slaves connected to the Criner family, as shown in census records found in the Huntsville-Madison County Public Library. Several of the Criner slaves are said to be buried in Mount Paran, with the confirmation of Miss Ellen S. Wallace being there. Now, Ellen Wallace was born in 1837 and lived to 1953. She was over 100 years old when she died. She was mentioned in her obituary as having recollected the story of being sold as a slave when she was less than 10 years old. She lived through the Civil War, Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau becoming a more common thing in the South, the technological innovations of horse and carriage being replaced with car, candle replaced with light bulb, piano replaced with radio. She lived through World War I, which there were 2 individuals buried in Mount Paran who died in 1918, both of which were male and may have been connected to World War I. She saw the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression and World War II. This woman lived through a lot. And the image to the right is her daughter and granddaughter. And Miss Ellen Wallace also had an infant buried in the cemetery who was said to have been the daughter of her and her husband, who died at less than 1 year old. So Ellen Wallace is one of the examples of how Mount Paran ties together all of this history. We go from Samuel Davis fighting in Virginia during the Revolutionary War to Ellen Wallace dying less than 10 years after the closing of World War II. In conclusion, cemeteries are finite resources and dwindling every day. The stories uncovered in Mount Paran are the tales of a nation from the birth of the US all the way until the 1980s being the latest headstones. In the picture shown here, you can see how Mount Paran is limited in what's still there and fading more every single day. The workers at the cemetery are doing everything that they can, but it's projects like this that are imperative to the preservation of the history of North Alabama and the history of US as a whole. Thank you.